Hi, I'm Matt Donnelly, and this is your Baltimore Ravens versus the Cincinnati Bengals game day preview. We've got some Sunday night football. We have an AFC North divisional showdown between two of the biggest rivals in today's game. And we're going to start off by talking about how much these Ravens have struggled. Now, per Ilias Sports there, the Ravens are just the second team in NFL history to take multiple losses after leading by more than 17 points within the first four games of the season. That futility there, that joins the 2011 Minnesota Vikings. Now, hopefully, John Harbaugh here gives analytics a rest this week. Meanwhile, the Cincinnati Bengals, they are coming off a big win over the previously undefeated Miami Dolphins. So let's get into this tale of the tape here, starting with the quarterback position and starting with the Baltimore Ravens. Now, Lamar Jackson last week, he threw for just 144 yards with 2 interceptions and a passer rating that was less than 65. However, on the season, Jackson has thrown for 893 yards and a league-high 11 touchdowns. He's also added an additional 2 touchdowns on the ground and another 316 yards. Jackson's average depth of target through the first 4 weeks of the season has been 9.3 yards, which is the third highest among the quarterbacks. The job of trying to contain Lamar Jackson this week, that rests on the shoulders thereof Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard. Now, we know you can't stop Lamar Jackson. You can only hope to contain him, as he is one of the best passers and rushing quarterbacks in the league today. But when you try to contain Lamar Jackson, when you try and stop him, if that's what your end goal is trying to be, you have to be smart about it. Last week against the Miami Dolphins, Sam Hubbard, he had 3 quarterback hits, but no one's going to be mistaking Teddy Bridgewater for Lamar Jackson anytime soon. Last week, Buffalo, they brought pressure, pressuring Jackson on nearly 30% of his dropbacks. Someone's going to need to be spying on Lamar Jackson here, keeping one eye in the backfield at all times, whether that be Logan Wilson or Jermaine Pratt. Now, my bet is going to be Jermaine Pratt's going to be keeping an eye on there, because Logan Wilson, he may be asked to do other things as this game continues. Now, Wilson, he has 26 tackles on the season and could add a few more if Lamar Jackson decides to take off and run with the ball. There's also this guy named Mark Andrews that may command a little extra attention this week. Now, on the other side, you have Joe Burrow there, who threw for 287 yards and 2 touchdowns with a 115.9 passer rating. That passer rating, it has gone up each and every time here over the last 4 weeks. He also had a 9.3 yards per attempt there last week against the Miami Dolphins. Now, the Ravens secondary, they held up, so to speak, against Josh Allen, limiting him to just 5.9 yards per attempt in the rain and a 68.4 passer rating. Baltimore's defense last week, they also had 1 sack on 38 dropbacks. So they'll need to get more pressure on Joe Burrow somehow, some way in this contest, and hope that Burrow can make a mistake along the way. Now, let's give Cincinnati Bengals, their offensive line, a little bit of credit there. Last week against the Miami Dolphins, Burrow was only sacked once. In fact, he's only been sacked 3 times in the last 2 contests, where he was sacked 13 times in the first 2 weeks of the Bengals season. Now, turning our attention to the running back position, how about J.K. Dobbins and the return of J.K. Dobbins? Now, Lamar Jackson, he's still going to be the primary ball carrier. And last week, Jackson, he did lead the way once again with 73 yards on 11 carries against the Bills after back-to-back 100-yard games the previous weeks. Now, last week, Dobbins, to his credit, 13 carries, 41 yards, 1 touchdown on the ground. It worked out to about 3.2 yards per carry while he's trying to work his way back from those injuries. Now, he did add an additional 4 receptions there for 22 yards and 2 touchdowns. And Justice Hill, he added 5.6 yards per carry on 8 carries last week. Hill is doubtful for this contest because of an injury that he suffered last week. Now, Gus Edwards, maybe he can kind of take a little bit of that burden off there. Gus Edwards, he is eligible to come off the PUP list here this week. I don't know if it's going to happen. They may give it 1 more week there. Now, the Bengals, they are holding teams to less than 4 yards per carry on the season and have allowed 279 yards on the ground, which happens to be the 5th fewest to date. For the Bengals, it starts and ends with Joe Mixon in this run game. Mixon last week, 74 yards and a touchdown on 28 touches, with 4 of those coming in the passing game. Do the Ravens get this run defense sorted out this week, or does Joe Mixon get going, get back on track here? Mixon is averaging less than 3 yards per carry, while the Ravens, they allowed Devin Singletary and the Bills to average 5 yards per carry last week. Mixon ranks first in expected fantasy points, second in rushing attempts, third in targets. So why is there such a lack of production? Well, how about ranking 48th in yards per carry and 48th in yards after contact? If you're not picking up any yards after you get contacted, chances are you're not going to get those fantasy points. Now, speaking of fantasy points, let's turn our attention to the wide receiver position. Hey, we know there's all kinds of production coming on the Cincinnati Bengals side, but what about the Baltimore Ravens? What have they been able to do in the past so far this season? Rashad Bateman, you're going to want to be paying close attention to the injury report and paying attention to the practice reports leading up to this one. As Bateman, he suffered a bit of a foot injury last week that limited him to 3 catches and just 17 yards. Chidobe Awazi there, he's held guys to about a 53.2 passer rating so far this season with 3 passes defended on 36 targets. So in all likelihood, he is going to be the primary man responsible for Bateman in this contest. If Bateman's going to struggle this week, if he's still battling that injury, then the Baltimore Ravens are going to need some secondary production in this receiving core, and that's going to come from Devin Duvernay, who saw 5 targets, hauling in 4 of them last week for 51 yards against a very tough Bills secondary. Cincinnati, they're not quite as good at defending opposing receivers in fantasy as Buffalo's been, but they've been pretty okay there, allowing just 31.35 fantasy points per game, which happens to be the 12th fewest. If Awazi's on Bateman, that means you can expect Duvernay to see a lot of Eli Apple this week. And Eli Apple, he has an 83.1 rating there on 20 targets. Now let's talk about those Cincinnati Bengals pass catchers here, starting with Jamar Chase last week. 4 catches, 81 yards on 6 targets. We get a Chase versus Marlon Humphrey showdown here this week. Marlon Humphrey has 2 interceptions on the season there, so you can look for at least 2 to be locking up. A big physical matchup is sure to go down here. Now we know Jamar Chase has had the Ravens number here the last couple seasons. So if you're expecting Jamar Chase to pop off any week, it's a game against the Ravens. Now, Tee Higgins on the other side there last week, 7 catches, 124 yards, 1 touchdown on 9 targets. Higgins is going to be facing off with Marcus Peters. We know Peters has a tendency to go for the ball more than the body more often than not there, which kind of leads him to some big play potential there. He's also given up multiple touchdowns this season there and has a 111.9 passer rating against. In 21 games in which Higgins and Chase have played together, Higgins has seen 166 targets and averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game, while Chase has averaged 17.6 fantasy points on 170 targets. What is more interesting that of the two, Higgins seems to be more consistent, posting at least 60 yards receiving in 14 of the 17 contests. Now, if you could take away Chase, if you take away Higgins, we know Marcus Peters, we know Marlon Humphrey are good corners here when it's all said and done. They just haven't played up to that expectation so far this season. But who is going to cover Tyler Boyd? Last week, 2 catches, 47 yards on 5 targets. Who's going to stop Boyd? I don't know. That could be the game within the game and see how these Ravens match up against the Bengals, because we know right now that the Ravens have not matched up very well against wide receivers all season long. Now, turning our attention to some other pass catchers here where the Ravens may have an advantage, and that is at the tight end position where Mark Andrews, don't expect him to be held to 2 catches for 15 yards again this week. Cincinnati, they are allowing 10.63 fantasy points per contest to the tight end position, and they have allowed 20 receptions at 245 yards through 4 weeks. If you're wondering who's going to be responsible for Andrews, then that's where I'm going to guess that Logan Wilson, who has an interception, a couple passes defended on 18 targets thus far this season, he's probably going to be the first man up there with Von Bell to provide some additional assistance. Now, for the Cincinnati Bengals, we have a revenge game going down here. Hey, I don't know if Hayden Hurst is going to go off, but he's got more than enough reason to do so. Every time you get an opportunity for the revenge game, you got to take it. Now, Baltimore, they have allowed 17 receptions this season for 133 yards to the tight end position. But this isn't just your regular game. This is a revenge game for Hayden Hurst and the Cincinnati Bengals here. So, you know what? Let's give Hayden Hurst a little bit of a bump up in those rankings because of this matchup. With that all being said, if you love to get those advanced matchups, head over to fantasypoints.com. Check out the work that Wes Huber's putting out there where those advanced matchups there. Use promo code 22Vipers10. Get 10% off that subscription today. Trust me, you will not regret it. One of the best bang for your buck websites out there today. We'll see you next time.